Knowledge, Technology, and Innovation Group out of Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Although I live full-time in the Andes, I've been in Latin America since 1986, before many of you were born, unfortunately. And our farm, Miriam, my wife, is over there. We have a family farm called Wageningen in the Andes, and I shouldn't be a surprise. I don't know. And we have two foundations that helped to create Microbiota and Groundswell International. So the different spaces that we work with, I think with a lot of you, sort of being practitioners, activists, and academics. I'm all involved in that. Since Miriam became full-time at Fluxo, I have been much more a full-time farmer, so much more dedicated to that. But we've been working a lot with people like Edward, who is here or was here, and others around this question of pushing the envelope of soil health in the Andes. And so in this talk, what I want to do is talk about how that's really transformed our way of thinking and farming and within the organic agroecology movements, particularly in Ecuador, but it goes beyond that. I grew up farming in the U.S., in the East Coast, in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, very different style of farming. But it's been interesting to me personally. And this sort of issue, because Edward and I work a lot with First Nations, indigenous people, Quechua speakers in the Andes, and primarily women who do a lot of the agriculture, is it's very much about rediscovering our cultures, but also the Andean culture, the Andean cosmovision, the notion of sumak kosai, which in Andean culture is sort of the center of the chacana, which is the sort of managing the central life force that runs through things, right? And that's a sumak kosai. Apologies for using the Anthropocene. I know there's emphasis in different ways of questioning that. In this case, we're viewing ourselves as a species and an existential threat, regardless of our culture, because we find that microbes really don't care about my sex, my religion, etc. Microbes have a different perspective. And how can we perform as a species so that we can continue to be part of this planet? And that's sort of the challenge that we've taken on with farmers. I just want to mention I don't have any conflicts of interests. We've been explicit about this in the agroecology movements and food movements in Ecuador because of multiple problems that we've had. The project that I'll be sharing is largely funded by IDRC, working with a number of universities, including the University of Montreal and Wageningen. And the question I have, and I've started doing this at the university, is giving the exam questions the first day of class. And usually like 3 or 10, it's created a problem with review boards. But anyhow, this is today's question. Okay? And then at the end of the course, we come back to these exam questions. But what commonalities do you find between what I'll be talking about and human health? Okay, I didn't want to answer that question explicitly. There's a lot of challenges. This is a very healthy, photograph of soil because of the aggregates. And what we've learned in agriculture is good soil management is taking care of the spaces in the soil. Okay, and what does that have to do with human health? And how do you achieve that is a huge question, for farmers. Particularly farmers like me. I studied plant pathology. I was taught how to kill microbes, right? Focus on pathogens. In many ways, it's very similar to maybe dietary nutritionists, right? It's all about getting nutrients into the plant, and we have now learned what the damage of that is. And it's very different. The pathway to managing diseases is very different than the pathway to managing health. And often by studying problems, studying disease, you don't necessarily get to the right answers. So I very much am focused and inspired by the salutogenic approaches. Donald Cole was one of my PhD supervisors. And we did a lot of work in Carchi on degenerative agriculture, particularly looking at pesticides, as a way of life, right? Which is very contradictory. We have a serious problem, right, when our food is a principal or leading, in Ecuador it's a leading cause of death, for example, food-related disease. But when food begins to undermine our ecosystems, and so a lot of our work has been on this. This has been the contribution of science. My study was 75 years, but this is a piece of the data. And science should be improving the productivity of food and the ecological resilience, etc. It should be improving nutrition. But unfortunately, we haven't done that. And so I think it's and this is where we live and work, and this is the kind of effect that we've had. Okay? You would think that and this is where we're starting now. And in fact, that's where our farm started. Okay? And why soils? So the question is, this issue is that soils as the center of the organization of terrestrial ecosystems, right? And helping farmers to begin to discover that. And the work that we've been doing has been now, at least the policy work globally, is how do we mobilize the 550 million family farmers, smallholder farmers out there, who occupy about almost 4 billion hectares. Okay, and how can those people, through clear knowledge, can become active in regenerating? Okay, healthy food, but also becoming central actors in ecosystem restoration. In this case, climate change mitigation. And we've been lobbying for increased funding for that. This is Miriam, actually, when we bought our land. And that's the kind of land that we farm. It's called Concagua and Quichua, which is a cemented ash rock mineral. There's about 200,000 hectares of that. We're working with those communities. And how can we shape and transition and rehabilitate 200,000 hectares? It's very strategic for us for two reasons. One is, it's where the poorest of the poor live. Okay, these Andean Quechua people. But secondly, it's also strategic for carbon drawdown. Okay, if you want to increase terrestrial carbon, you go to where there is very little to no carbon in the ground. And that's where we can increase stocks. In this case, 10, 15 metric tons per hectare per year. Okay, this is just an example of our farm, and we very much have been involved in this over the last 20 years through a process of sweat and tears and phases of hope and desperation, including this morning. But just want to show that this is something we take very seriously, right? This has been a major process in our life. We both grew up on farms in different parts of the world. So this isn't, as others have said, this isn't abstract, right? This is very real to us. And there's strategies that we've developed with the farmer movements. And this emerges, for me and I think Miriam, out of our work in Central America 35 years ago. We worked a lot with ecological literacy, inspired by like Paulo Freire and people who, the kind of work that I know Pablo's involved in, which is, awareness raising, developing consciousness, unlocking creativity through knowledge. But it's a messy encounter of ontologies, right? When I start to combine scientific knowledge with farmer knowledge and all the problematic aspects of that you have to navigate. Okay? And one of the things, to give you an example, we do these walk in time, a walk of petagenesis. In my case, from that rock of the volcano up to a native forest, a 5-kilometer walk where every step is 100 million years. Okay? And we have actors pop up, along the way, at 1.5 kilometers, you step up, I'm surrounded by bacteria. And they talk about what I do. And I'm the first to do photosynthesis on this planet. You walk another kilometer, I'm a bacteria. And the bacteria talks about how it reproduces, what its sort of role is in mineralization. You walk a half kilometer further, you get into a fungi. Oh, I'm a protoplant, right? I'm going to become a plant once I meet the cyanobacteria and develop leaves and photosynthesis. But right now, I construct soil, and I eat lignans. And you go on and on. And they walk, and after 5 kilometers, the last step and a half, a human pops up. Okay? So it's sort of an activity to help people understand coevolution. It creates problems with evangelicals and others who are in the group, and that comes up. But we deal with that. But anyhow, when did soil start? In the relationship between photosynthesis and plants, and is shifting from an anaerobic to an aerobic environment, and what that meant for multicellular species. And once they get that going, it's really interesting how it unlocks creativity. So we work with this, that's just one of many activities we do with farmers. And it's really to get a conversation going and to provoke farmer-led experimentation. Okay? And we do lots of experiments. I know Edward's also involved in this. On seed mixing, we do a lot of bioassays. So we test a lot of ideas in pots, and we are pretty systematic about it. We learn how to isolate organisms and use selective medias to multiply into more pathogens. And it's really to get people to put their chief labor force at work, which are not humans, right? It's microbiology. And once you can manage microbiology as a farmer, you unlock a huge tool, right? And it's the primary source. And so what we talk about is this planet is governed by microbes. And if we cannot work with them in a very explicit, strategic way as farmers, if we don't have that ecological literacy, it really limits our ability to be successful. We do use scientific backstopping. I won't get into that around soils, but we have a whole team of scientists from Wageningen, from Cornell University, who are working with us from other universities to backstop in this study. Are these proposals actually working? Are we increasing organic matter? Are we increasing aggregation, water holding capacity, productivity, etc.? So we do have a team of people working on questions of rigor, and feeding that back as problematic as that can be. And we had these continual encounters. So it's sort of, I just want to summarize the dynamic before I go on to end with the comment about how we have rethought health in soils and ecosystems. And you can imagine these are all pioneers in different encounters to share experiments that happen. We try to get them going on every 15 days in localities. So it's a constant conversation. Let's see. And we do a lot of policy intervention in the government. You know, we have a big kind of a Woodstock soil assembly. It's called the Tinkuukupacha, which is about 300 to 500 people will be camping out, 3-day festival, about farmers sharing what they're doing, music. And it's really much more occupied by artists, by the way. As I mentioned before, we're still pushing science, let's say knowledge-based interventions, but we really realize a lot of these things are not economic in the beginning. And you have to kind of enter through the passions, through the affect, kind of fall in love with the idea of soil and microbiology, etc. And so we actually I find the best entry point is not rationality for many people. We have different styles of learning, but really some sort of affect, some sort of emotional call. We also have this Grassroots Innovation Alliance we're working with, which is now global. The Grassroots Innovation Assembly, which is an innovation group, by of farmers. There is a Quebec farmer group that met us. We were in India a couple weeks ago, sharing sort of, creating this space. Not that we're anti-science, right? But it's more letting farmers drive the agenda in their own way, and then drawing on science as a support policy. And we've been able to change the FAO's global policy on climate change, where now soil management is a central piece of that. So we've written 2 papers. This is one on enabling farmer-led ecosystem restoration, which was published a couple months ago, which is really about how farmers can, doing the maths, and the role that farms can do when they shift from being a net source of carbon to a net sink across 3.4 billion hectares, right? And how they can completely address, in a strategic way that addresses food insecurity, but also allows farmers to become a purposeful, central, valuable piece of modern society, right? Particularly at a moment when our species is probably disappearing. Okay. So these sort of essential learnings is that we want farmers to get in different ways as microbes governing the planet, how microbes regulate plant soil health, right? In agriculture, we're taught that it's the soil that feeds the plant, but of course it's the other way around. It's the plant that feeds the soil. And that's central to farmers to know. That's how we went from a rock to a sponge. And an atmosphere, and an oxygen dominant, well not dominant, but 21% oxygen in the atmosphere. That was key. And understanding that is important for farmers to understand that the goal of any farm is maximizing photosynthesis, as you said the other day. Okay? And the understanding that microbial necromass, dead microbes, is the best way to increase soil organic matter, not plant material. And these sorts of things, an essential role that microbes play in a healthy ecosystem in mediating access to nutrients. Microbes increase the intensity of roots by 600 to 2,000 times. The ability to find films of water on minerals. Okay? The ability to regulate balanced nutrition, which is essential for plants to keep symbiosis going, etc. These are things that farmers really have to understand. Okay? And the essential learning about symbiosis, about 40% actually, it's above 20 to 40% of sunlight that comes through a plant in the form of photosynthase is fed to microbes. Right? A plant gives almost half of all of its energy to microbes. And the problem that we create when we over-fertilize, I don't care if it's organic or synthetic, okay? We completely screw up symbiosis. The plant will stop giving photosynthesis or synthase to the microbes, and we create a situation where the farmer has to continue to feed the plant. Okay, and you create this dependence, and you kill the ability of plants to alter defense mechanisms, which is also mediated by the microbes, etc. And they learn about how when they learn this insight, they realize automatically, right? I don't have to tell them to stop tilling. When they learn that microbes live in communities, okay, and the damage you can do when you till to microbial communities, then we have to start to talk about that. So these sort of new principles we want to get into the soil as a space of ecosystem health. And these questions of webs, okay, and how the sort of flow of life. Okay, and this comes quite clear with the women, the Andean women who say we always felt the Pachamama, right? But we had never seen it before until we start to look at it under microscopes. And they start to learn about functional microbial communities and how do you manipulate those communities for different strategic purposes. And the power you give to an indigenous woman who all of a sudden can make explicit what she felt and be able to utilize that for different strategic purposes. And one thing I also want to talk about, this is from like 15 theses from just the last year. When I start to look at correlations, okay, across our studies and different ways of observing soil life, and these are kind of classic ways. Blue means correlation, by the way. And what was your response, Peter, when you looked at this the other day?
Nothing works.
So what does that mean? You have to be really careful about scientific, we can't reproduce the scientific methods. That's how dynamic and complex the soil life is, right? Particularly in the rhizosphere, which is 2,000 times the population that we get, 60 or 80 centimeters from a plant, right? You'll never understand it. We're never going to understand the soil. It's beyond human capacity for learning as far as I'm concerned. I've been working for, 40 years on questions of soil, and I feel like I know less than I knew 40 years. But then we get these sort of principles coming out. These are successional periods, a climax forest and a Concagua desert that we've created. And how can you progress, successionally, and the impact that has on things like pH. Farmers can get this if it's taught in the right way through an experiential, more than a 20-minute talk. Right? The challenge becomes, how can farmers, manage this forward and backwards based on the crops they want to grow? And we do this through inoculants. We do this through food, creating niches for microbes. And that's kind of where farmers go. And these are the conversations we're having. How can I manipulate the management I have farm to move it to where I want it to be, which is typically through some sort of agroforestry system here. So let me go forward. And so we use pseudoscience, right? These are methods that I wouldn't call scientific, but they're very useful. Brix readings through a refractometer to understand how to maximize photosynthesis. And looking at some of this legitimate research, in this case done by Tom Dijkstra, who was the guy I worked with at Cornell, to kind of get a feeling for how you can understand what is a plant performing photosynthetically. Because that's where the rubber hits the road. That's the goal, So it's sort of pseudoscientific, but it kind of works. We do a lot of work. At the end of the day, this is the space that we want to study. We're working with people in Andhra Pradesh and India, but mainly in the Andes, and looking at the rhizosphere and what we call the rhizosheath. When endophytes, microbes, get inside the plant, and you can't shake out the dreadlocks. That's called a rhizosheath. And that's where symbiosis is taking place. When I see that, I know I have symbiosis, and things are happening. And we do these simple, with cameras, this is called a snake test. It allows us to digitalize aggregation. So we can monitor, is microaggregation increasing or decreasing? It's a free program developed by the Soil Health Institute. a lot of microscopy and sampling. How do you reduce a hectare to a 5 millimeter drop of water? Right? And so how do you do that? And sampling, and farmers learn how to do that too. These expert farmers. And we can reduce that. We have simple applications. We can do kind of counts. It'll give us microbial counts to make sure we're hitting targets in our inoculants. For example, in the biomass of fungi and bacteria, which is one of the indicators we look at, we have kids doing this. Okay, this girl's in 6th grade, right? They come visit the farm for my daughter's school, just to kind of get access to this. That's an nematode. And so what do we look for? So this is the Concagua. This is a climax forest. This is a field from our farm. And we start to look at questions about aggregates, the color of the water, bacterial populations. This is taken at 400 times. We start to look at things like ciliates and flagellates that show that it's anaerobic. Okay? And how we can shift through managing an anaerobic environment to an aerobic, and how that transforms your soil. Okay? So these are the sort of simple ways that you can start to understand microscopically, because I see things under a microscope that I'll see 3 years before I see it in my soil. Right? So I know if something's going in the right direction. We need to finish up. And at the end of the day, it helps us get to this point that these are things that humans can manage. Photosynthesis, through balanced nutrition, achieving sort of complete protein synthesis. Okay, in plants, the photosynthesis indeed is leading to growth. But these areas are only managed by microbes. And I'll never have this if I don't have symbiosis. If I don't perform agriculture that's dependent on the microbes, where the plants feed the microbes and then they intermediate the relationships, including the production of secondary metabolites, which drives the auto-defense of a plant. You'll never do this through organic agriculture where you over-fertilize. Okay? The goal is to create symbiosis. And I'm on my second to last slide. And well, what's really interesting is that through this process of exploration, we've come to discover that the solution is the chakra. These sort of agroforestry, diverse systems that allows us to maximize photosynthesis, to have diverse plants, because diverse plants feed diverse populations that will compete and achieve natural balances in the soil. Okay? And so all of a sudden, the idea is to get the women, people, they're mainly women because they're the farmers who we're working with, to get to the conclusion that that's a chakra. We're like, you're right. And then the goal is how do we strengthen the chakra? Well, that's our job right now. And we look about how do you increase biodiversity, and that's what these people are doing. We increase flowers into the systems, enough groups, we get the right combinations of competition, etc. And I'll end with this slide. And so can farmers become stewards of ecosystem restoration? And these are the sort of comments that came out of a conversation with Yolanda, who's there, okay, who's a master trainer, a farmer, who lives in our community. And these are the kind of things that pop up, and I've heard her start to emphasize. You know, the more we move the ground, the more we warm the planet. Okay? She'd put a manure in the nose of another person and says, smell this. This is the smell of death. Okay, because of methane, because you can't apply manure. It has to be cycled through microbes before you give it to the crop, and why that's important. Using over-fertilization creates anaerobes and undermines soil life. Farmers can understand this through a process of, and put this to work. When we overfeed the soil, we end symbiosis. A farmer's chief workforce are her microbes. Okay? We farmers have made a mistake. The soil does not feed the plants, it's the plants that feed the soil. Okay? And then the best way to improve a soil is through live roots pumping in photosynthesis. So I go back to my original question. What insight does this hold? These are a group of people. I think Edward is with us. Where are you, Edward? Hey, same thing. But we're working with about 150 kind of pioneering farmers of agroecology. There's many more farmers in Ecuador, 250,000 families. But these are the ones who are sort of driving the frontier and demonstrating how knowledge and farmer-led experimentation, organization, and communication of that can open up new pathways to healthier food, but also through ecosystem restoration.